Let me welcome everyone to this digital lecture, our continuation of our Austrian Research Association lecture series on peaceful change. And I'd like to welcome the members of the network. I've seen quite a few of you are there. I'd like to welcome our students, and I'd also obviously like to welcome everyone who joins us via the Facebook stream. Let me introduce you very quickly to today's speaker, just very briefly, and then I'm going to hand over. He's going to talk for about half an hour, and then we're going to have ample time for questions and answers. Professor Oberhofer is Professor of Economics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And he's also senior researcher at the Austrian Institute of Economic Research and a research fellow at CIS-WIFO in Munich. He has plenty of research interests and publishes very widely. Interests encompass applied econometrics, empirical industrial organization, international economics, and empirical political economy. And he published in several really fantastic journals, mentioning just a few of them: European Economic Review, Empirica, Journal of Public Economics, Econometrics, Journal of Comparative Economics, and so on and so forth. Harald, probably judging just by the title of the paper, my favorite one was the one on the German Football League, Firm Survival in Professional Sports.
We actually have two on football.
I'm obviously very interested in football, no, but jokes aside, there's a very wide range of research interests. And he's going to talk today on international trade, economic growth, and inequality. Under normal circumstances, Harald, there would be a round of applause now. Digitally, that's more difficult to do. And because of that, I'm just going to hand over to you straight away.
Well, thank you very much, Markus. Thanks everybody for joining in. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and a great honor to be able to talk for half an hour. I'm going to talk about a topic. Well, obviously, one could talk for hours, I would guess. So it's a very broad one and a very important one, I would say, also from a policy perspective. So here we are. So I'm going to talk about international trade, economic growth, and inequality. As I've said, it's a very broad topic, obviously, and it's based on joint work with two colleagues, Harald and Jesus, from the department, where we did a small piece which we labeled "International Trade: Facts and Fictions." So the idea here is to talk a little bit more about facts, because there's so much fiction out there. And before starting, just a brief note. So in economics, what we typically think is one of our fundamental principles would be that when two subjects freely engage in trade with each other, then they would do this because that's in their mutual interest. And so basically we would be happy to allow free trade, in the sense that we would want to allow people to interact with each other and trade goods with each other. So that's basically one of our fundamentals. And actually, from this viewpoint, it's kind of surprising that international trade is somehow treated differently, because actually we're just talking about borders instead of domestic trade, where we typically don't have big issues on whether we want to allow them or not. So that's just for a starting point. But maybe to start with, my first slide, just want to give you something about an impression we got over the last couple of years, that we view globalization, or we observe that globalization is somehow viewed in what we would call a post-factual world. So facts are not that important anymore. We have a lot of populists around. So just think about Donald Trump in the United States. And they are actually not much about evidence or facts, and that's basically an issue where science should jump in and try to bring at least the facts on the table, that we can discuss issues based on facts and evidence. So that's the basic motivation. So we have a new discussion on the macroeconomic effects of globalization and trade in general. And as I've said, that this discussion, if you look at the media or some specific outlets, quite often seems to be driven by ideological prejudices or at some points bad science. I'll just bring quotes where people are very specific and very certain that trade would be bad. So for example, free trade slows down economic growth. Globalization has been responsible for the sluggish global economic development over the last decade. Or that globalization has led to worsening of working conditions, to wage pressure, child labor, and so on, as well as to failing quality in product, failing quality of products. So these type of arguments you quite often hear, and we as economists think that's our job, well, to bring the evidence to the table, so to talk about what do we know actually about those two relationships. So one would be international trade and economic development, and the other one would be about international trade and income inequality. And before concluding, I also want to discuss a little bit about international trade and environmental policy issues, because they also gained a lot of interest, obviously, due to global warming and climate crisis over the last years, I would say. So that's the background to start with. So what do we know? Maybe to start a little bit in terms of an illustration, I brought something from 2019 from the Salt Lake Tribune. That's a cartoon about Donald Trump's trade conflict with Europe as well as with China. And so this picture simply shows Donald Trump with a flag on trade war and a quote where he's saying, now I've got them right where I want them. And he's hiding behind severely hurt manufacturing and farm industries. And that's basically something which I think might fit nicely into this lecture series. So this is the result of a very specific view on the world, especially when it comes to trade and economic issues. So what Donald Trump basically has in mind is that trade always is a zero-sum game. In a sense, if somebody wins, the other one has to lose. In our standard theory, trade theory would argue the other way around. And moreover, if you're in this position to view that trade is a zero-sum game, then you don't understand that you can hurt yourself by imposing protectionistic measures in terms of trade policy. And this is illustrated here, for example. So what you have is why is manufacturing and farms hurt by the trade war? So we're talking about these two industries in the US in this cartoon. The story is rather simple. Farms are hurt because China retaliated on the trade conflict and imposed counterbalancing tariffs on many farm products from the US, which severely hurts the farm industry in the United States. Why is manufacturing hurt? Actually, that's what Donald Trump tried to protect by imposing additional tariffs on steel, for example. The problem here is that steel is an input which is used for a lot of products, right? So just imagine about producing cars and so on and so forth, or machines, or industrial products in general. And the problem is if you're imposing tariffs, then prices for this input product steel will increase. And if this input prices increase in your country, you're losing competitiveness on all the industries which are heavily dependent on this input. So the car industry in the US might be hurt by having more expensive steel inputs as compared to Europe or China, for example, because they do not impose additional tariffs, if that's the case. And so what you see is that those two are hurt. And on top of that, typically tariffs can be viewed just as something like a tax. And from simple economic theory, we know that a tax has some incidence. So some of the costs are to be burdened by the producers and some are by the consumers. And the consumers will be hurt by increasing prices. So let's assume again, steel price increase, car prices also increase. So for US consumers of US cars, their real prices for cars increase, and that hurts consumers that want to buy cars or other products, whatever you can imagine. And if you look at the literature, then there are already some estimates out there on the impact of Donald Trump's trade conflict with China. or in general with all the tariffs he imposed in 2018 by Mary Amiti and co-authors, which basically find out that the costs for US consumers and importers amounted to about $1.4 billion per month, every month from the mid of 2018, just due to this protectionistic policies. So in other words, people are also paying the price for protectionistic policies also in their market. So that's basically just kind of a rather long introduction. And now I want to come directly to the point of, well, what do we know about international trade and economic growth? And actually, that's one of the most established relationship in terms of consensus in the academic or economic literature. To start with, again, just an illustration from a paper of 2005. What you see here is basically on the y-axis, you have GDP growth per capita in percent, and on the x-axis, you have a growth in export volume also in percent. And this graph is constructed for 6 world regions. So for Western Europe, another region would be the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, which is often called the Western offshoots. Then for Eastern Europe, including Russia, Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and for 6 different time periods, starting very early already in 1870 and going to intervals to 1998. And all of these points in the graph are simply one of the 6 regions in one of those 4 time windows and the relationship between GDP growth and trade growth, if you will. And what you basically see here is that there is, if you just put a simple regression line in there like here, what you see is that there is a positive relationship. I'm not talking about causality yet. So there is a positive relationship with a slope coefficient of 0.3, which would imply, well, if growth in export volume increases by 1%, then GDP growth per capita would increase by 0.3%. So that's how you would read this graph. But of course, that's just an association. So in times where export growth was higher by about 1%, GDP per capita growth was also larger by 0.3%. So that's this kind of a positive relationship. But obviously, the world is much more complicated. It's not just like you have only GDP per capita growth and export growth, and that's all you want. You have reasons why countries grow, why countries trade more. So we need to think about establishing a causal link. So if you causally change exports, trade in general, what would happen to GDP growth? So that's the basic idea of economics, that we always want to have a kind of ceteris paribus effect. So everything else should be constant, nothing should change. And then we want to ask what happens if you engage more in international activities, doing more international trade, what would be the result for growth here? There is a long literature in economics studying this question, and a basic idea to establish causality in this framework is to use the idea that we are very familiar in international economics, which is the so-called gravity model. The gravity model is a very simple idea that says that, well, economies that are closer to each other and that are larger will trade more with each other. So it's basically like a gravitational force. If you're closer, then you engage more into economic exchange via cross-border trade. And also if your size is larger, then the gravitational forces is larger, and size is typically GDP or population in this context. And the idea of this literature then is simply that you want to use the variation in trade that is only driven by geographical information. So on how many neighbors you have, how large you are, basically to assess the causal effect of trade on economic growth. So that has been established by this very influential Franklin-Roma paper in 1999. So why is that important to have this kind of exogenous variation? We would view geography as exogenously determined, which you can of course question, but let's assume for the moment that's valid. Why do we need this? Well, there are a lot of reasons to believe that other forces are place in the relationship between economic growth and trade. Just imagine institutional quality. So what is about the institutional quality, the institutions, how well they are working within an economy, right? And if you have better institutions, then that might simultaneously affect your growth opportunity as well as your trade opportunities. So if, for example, the absence of corruption might be helpful both for just engaging in business, which helps the economy to grow, and it might also help to establish long-lasting relationships with trading partners, which would help you to trade more. So we need to figure these effects out in order to come up with just a trade effect is. On the other side, especially at a very macroeconomic level, if we just aggregate trade flows and just aggregate economic activity in a measure like GDP, then we might always be concerned with measurement issues. So whether just openness, which is typically used in this literature, openness to trade is simply exports plus imports over GDP. So it's just how open the economy in general is to its overall economic activity. And here we can argue that there might be measurement errors, that just these trade flows that administrative agencies can obtain not perfectly measure the true extent of international engagement of an economy. And for this other reason, we also want to make sure to have something exogenous that drives this effect we are actually looking for, which is the effect of trade or openness for economic growth. And if you then look into this literature, what you basically find that if this just positive effect here of 0.3 would be a lower bound estimate, if you just exploit geographical variation for explaining openness of an economy, then the estimates that a lot of studies find are typically larger. So as a result, what you can take from here, there is a robust finding in the literature that more open economies, more trading economies typically grow faster, holding everything else constant. That's of course always the important remark here we have to take when we talk about these bivariate relationships of interest. So that's the first, I would say, very important result. Openness, trade helps the economy to grow. In the next step, we're going to look at what that might imply for within country distribution of incomes. But before doing so, just another fact that I find quite interesting is a study from 2006 by Waples. It's a survey where 210 PhD economists had randomly selected from the American Economic Association, which is the most important economic association in the world, not surprisingly. And those 210 PhD economists have been questions about very different economic policy issues. And among those policy issues also have been some statements about trade or openness of economies. And what's interesting here is that if you ask economists, so what they would basically agree the most on is that free trade is very important. So basically the theme, so the theme is a cluster of a couple of questions with the maximal degree of agreement among these 210 PhD economists, which are randomly selected, is that international trade is on the role of international trade. And to give you a number, about 87.5% of the 210 surveyed PhD economists would support the argument that it's important to eliminate tariffs and other barriers to trade in order to foster economic prosperity. Okay, there other questions are in the same dimension of agreement. For example, 90% would agree that they are against any type of restrictions for employers to outsource work to foreign countries, for example. And that's very, very interesting because especially in economics, we tend to disagree a lot. So these numbers are relatively high or very high for economists, that economists are very united in their view about the role of international trade and the relevance of international trade. And now if you compare this agreement with another very important science discipline nowadays, which are climate scientists, these numbers for the relevance or the degree of agreement on the role of international trade is very much comparable to the agreement of climate scientists on the role of humans in terms of their responsibility for global warming. So there's a huge consensus in the climate science that humans are responsible for global warming, and the same is true for the role of international trade amongst the group of economists. Okay, so that's basically all I want to say for the moment on the relationship on international trade and growth. So to sum up, the literature clearly identifies positive effects: more openness, more trade, positively affects the overall outcome that we typically measure, or the overall wealth of an economy, as approximated by GDP, which is what economists quite often do, basically because that's the data which is most easily comparable across countries. Now, on the issue of international trade and income inequality, that's an important point, and basically that's also, I think, one of the main reasons why populists have been very successful in the past. Donald Trump I already mentioned, but also maybe the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom was the few, although for the Brexit, the evidence is that the trade issues didn't play a lot of role in the outcome of the referendum, but that's a different story. The story here is that one argument always brought forward is that there are losers from international trade, and economists ignore the fact that people might lose from international trade, and therefore basically the economists are to blame for that populists are now successful, because we never said that one should care about those people that are kind of threatened by international trade or indeed experience some economic backlash. Now, if you look at the theory in international economics, we have the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, which follows from the Hackshaw-Lin model, which is basically standard in economics since the 1950s. It's totally clear that trade will not only create winners, that there will be losers from trade. The basic story is that trade will make the overall cake larger, but this cake might be, or most likely is distributed in maybe a less equal way as before you open up for trade. And that's what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem basically predicts, is that changes in incomes after trade liberalization, so if we open up borders, if we reduce trade costs, if we reduce tariffs, if we make trade more easily possible, then that will have a direct impact on factor prices. And by factor prices, we simply mean wages and the rent for capital in a very stylized thinking. And the issue now is, if you open up, let's just for an illustration, if you open up as an economy for imports, then the import competing industries, or the industry which now competes with imports from abroad, will most likely experience a reduction in prices for their products due to more competition. And this reduction in prices will then lead to a relative decrease for the rent, which is wage or capital rent, for this factor which is most heavily used for the production of the specific good that now competes with international competitors. So in other words, or an example, in the US, if you open up for steel imports from China, which is for maybe other reasons, which we can discuss later also, is cheaper than the domestic production, that forces domestic producers to decrease their prices of domestic steel. And with same capital stocks in China and the US for steel production, which you can assume, then it's basically about labor that has to swallow this decrease in prices by a reduction in their relative rent, which implies a relative lose in their wages. So this is, from a theoretical point, something we know that this can happen and will happen. If we now look at the evidence, on the other side, what we see is indeed, that's also related to Stolper-Samuelson, of course, is that between country inequality, so the inequality in incomes across countries, so comparing average income in China with average income in Austria or the US or Britain, decreased. So the inequality across countries decreased due to globalization. So in other words, China and other economies profited a lot from international trade, seeing their average incomes or the total incomes raising. And that implies they are catching up to the Western world, if you want to say so, which is a good thing. So basically, because it also has the nice feature that the trade helped a lot to decrease extreme poverty in the world. The Stolper-Samuelson theorem, however, is much more about within-country inequalities. So the question is whether do people lose within a country that open up for imports, because the exporting economy would have the vice versa result. So if you're allowed to export more or cheaper because you don't have to bear tariffs, then the rent for this input, which is used heavily in the production for this good, which you now can export more easily, will increase, and that leads to this between country inequality reduction. But if we look within countries, so basically on the income inequality in the US or Austria, then Stolper-Samuelson would argue that, well, that might increase because some production factors might lose due to this more competitive environment in their goods market. The literature here is rather inconclusive, and the issue here again is that we have relatively hard work or difficulties in properly measure what we want to measure. So we want to have very detailed industry data on wages and employment and so on and so forth, and that's typically not so easy, at least on a global scale. However, Max Roser and Jesus from the department had a nice idea a couple of years ago. Well, because Stolper-Samuelson would say that imports from developing economies would be the relevant imports for Stolper-Samuelson to have an impact, because here we would have products where production costs are lower in developing economies and in sectors where a lot of labor is used for production. And then that should have an impact on the wages of workers in OECD economies in these very same industries. And this is basically what they can confirm when they only employ information on imports from developing economies instead of all imports from all different countries. So in other words, trade with the US is different than, or imports from the US might have different implications as imports from African countries, for example. So basically this literature shows, yeah, there are these effects and we can establish this link. So basically Stolper-Samuelson is true, and so that would imply that income inequality within a country on the importing side might indeed decrease if we just look at the direct effect of trade. However, the story is a little bit more complicated, because actually what we have is that we have so-called general equilibrium effects. So it's much more difficult to assess the overall effect just due to the fact, for example, that import prices decrease. That implies that for consumers, prices decrease. So if we can import goods and these are cheaper, then we as customers buy those goods cheaper. And if we buy those goods cheaper, that implies we can buy more different goods for a given income. So relatively, we can afford more if some goods are cheaper. And if you look at the structure of consumers, what you basically see is that especially poorer households are more dependent or consume relatively more of those tradable goods which we can import. And if poorer households can import cheaper products or buy products which are imported and thus cheaper, then they relatively gain, because for their given income, they can import or consume more goods, not only the imported ones, which would be a pro-poor effect of in a general equilibrium setting from more trade, which would at least somehow countervail the negative effect on wages. here. So that's the basic idea. So that's on income inequality. So basically the economic literature is aware of this issue. I think it's much more difficult to address this issue from an economic policy point of view, but that's maybe something for the discussion. Now, since I'm already a little bit long in my time, just on a couple of what I think are current challenges. On point 2, I think I have talked already a bit on trade wars and Brexit. These are both questions on the future of globalization somehow and on trade. And well, with respect to Brexit, at least in Europe, that's important. And we still don't know 1.5 months before a deal has to be concluded what the deal would look like and whether we would have one. The empirical evidence or the estimates on a no-deal Brexit look not very good, actually. So that could be very severe, especially for British folks, if we don't care about that. And get a proper deal between the EU and the United Kingdom. In terms of trade wars or trade conflict, I think here we need to see what happens with the maybe new president in the United States. I would guess that with respect to Europe, things can change a bit, but I'm not so sure whether they would also change in the relationship between the US and China. That's a different story. The first point, well, that's the most recent one, of course, is the global effects of COVID-19. So COVID-19 is basically a very sharp backlash for globalization, at least in the short run. So just to give some numbers, in the first 6 months of this year, world trade declined by approximately 10%. And that implies a lot of opportunities, especially for developing economies, are gone just due to the fact that we cannot trade and that income losses, especially in developed economies, are very high, which implies they can afford less, they will import less also from developing economies. Similar issues with FDI flows. Direct investments are important for bringing technology and innovation all over the world. That's something we just saw yesterday in terms of how you would try to come up with a vaccine against COVID. You see that that's a very global challenge, and that globalization helped a lot, at least for this first company to have some first success on it. And as a result, what we can already say is that COVID-19, at least in the short run, will increase the amount of people in extreme poverty and stops the catching up dynamics for middle-income countries like Brazil, for example. And the last point I wanted to mention, because that's also very relevant in terms of policy debates nowadays, is the question of the relationship between international trade and climate policy. So over the last couple of months, we had a quite a heated debate on the role of trade agreements and their environmental consequences. And especially in Austria, but also in other countries in the European Union, we have a lot of skepticism with respect to a newly, well, it took 20 years, but a newly agreed trade agreement, at least on the Commission side, between the European Union and the Mercosur economies. And here the main argument, at least from the majority, as far as I understand, against this agreement is that that would be harmful with respect to climate goals. Now, the issue here is, and that's related to my last point, is basically the question on whether trade agreements are really the best place to talk about climate policy. I would argue that climate change and climate policy is a global issue, so we actually need to have multilateralism instead of bilateral talks about this issue here. And we all know how difficult multilateral issues are to solve, but clearly speaking, without having China and the US on board as the whole globe, we will not be very successful in fighting climate change, would be my assumption. Yes, and maybe just to conclude on this, a statement from Amartya Sen, a very long one, which I think you can read on your own, is a statement on protectionism. And I find it very interestingly, especially this last sentence here. So it's one of the ironies of history of ideas that some who advocate radical politics today often fall for old economic positions that were so unequivocally rejected by Smith, Ricardo, and also Marx. So it's always interesting that we are coming back to something that has been shown that's not the best way forward to solve global problems. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments.
It was a great talk, connecting trade, growth, and inequality. Also very topical because of lots of things that happen right now, especially the COVID crisis, and the figures there that were really quite drastic. So we're going to move now to the questions and answer session. And I anticipate quite a few questions. That's why I'd like to bundle always 3 at a time. So all you'd have to do now is basically electronically raise your hand, and then I can give you the word.
Hi, it's Allison. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So I actually read the journal article on bilateral trade agreements and trade distortions in agricultural markets. And I was curious what, in your opinion, is the driver of success in bilateral free trade agreements compared to multilateral free trade agreements with respect to agriculture?
Great, Alison, thanks very much. Then we can do 2 more questions in the first bundle.
Hello, hi. It's Anna, and yes, and I would have actually, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I would have a very current question concerning, because you've already mentioned Trump and Brexit, and I would have a question concerning the United Kingdom and US trade relationship, also because of the newly president-elect Joe Biden. And I've read quite an interesting article stating that Joe Biden, we know that Joe Biden has a very, he has Irish roots, I think. And he actually really specifically put the focus on the Good Friday Agreement. And I would actually ask you what your opinion is on that, because do you see any effects also on the current negotiations with the European Union, and how would it affect the future relationship to the UK? On the one hand, the UK and the European Union, on the other hand, the UK-US trade relationship, because the US is, I think, next to European Union, its most important trading partner. And I find it quite interesting to see the effects on it. And I would have asked, what is your opinion about it? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. And I think that James, you wanted to say something. You've been wanting to say something for a while, huh?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So you mentioned that you believe that the effect on trade from COVID will be rather short-term. Don't you think, though, that the psychological shock of not having the necessary manufacturing for masks, testing, might extend the negative effect of COVID on international trade? For instance, might countries begin to expand what industries fall under national security exceptions with the WTO and thereby raise tariffs?
James, thank you. And Harald, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all the questions, very interesting ones. I'm just trying to answer them in order. So the first one was on bilateralism versus multilateralism with respect to agriculture products. I would like to answer this question in a more general setting. So the basic issue is that from an economics point of view, it's totally clear that multilateral agreements would always be favorable. So I would not go for arguing we should have a lot of bilateral agreements. The story about bilateral agreements is mainly due to the fact that WTO is not effective basically after 1995, no big progress in all those relevant aspects, including agricultural trade. And then especially the highly industrialized world thought, well, if WTO is not working, we go a different way. And that was bilateralism. And then that's the reason why we have all these, a lot of bilateral trade agreements. So basically, the European Union is close to having agreements with mainly the whole world, but just on a bilateral basis because it was not possible to have it within the framework of the WTO. But again, it would be preferable to do it there, and it would also be preferable, especially if you think about fighting climate change, to have multilateral agreements in force, like the Paris Agreement, also for combining this with trade issues, I think would be important, because what we actually still have a problem for sure is that transport is wrongly priced due to the fact that we do not take the externalities from CO2 emissions into account. And therefore, we're actually trading too much because the price for damaging the climate is not there yet. And I think this is something you can only effectively solve when you have multilateral agreements. So that's on the first one. Second one, Biden and Brexit. Well, I think I would totally agree with you on this issue. So it doesn't help for the negotiating position of the United Kingdom that Biden has Irish origins. That's for sure, because he knows the history. And this is basically what the Democrats and also Joe Biden always said, that they will protect the withdrawal agreement that has been signed between the European Union and the United Kingdom, and they will never sign a trade agreement with the UK without the fulfillment of the withdrawal agreement from the side of the United Kingdom. And the first reaction actually this weekend from the Prime Minister went basically in this direction, I would say. Well, he somehow said, well, he would be very happy to have an agreement with the European Union now. So I think he understands that it's a necessary condition to have good relationships with the European Union in order to succeed in their idea to have unilateral or bilateral trade agreements outside the European Union with the US. So that would be in the second. And on the third, COVID short term, well, that's a difficult question. Maybe the short-term argument is always what we hope for, in a sense that we are all hoping for normality. I don't know how fast that will kick in. That's difficult to say, really. And maybe, let's say, I would say short-term here would surely mean the next year and also 2022, I would guess. So it will take some time coming back to normal in some sense. Whether we totally come to normal, I don't know. Policy is always fast in reactions, so that we have to bring back some production of products that are important for hospitals and medical stuff. But at the end of the day, what happens if those short-run shortages in those products vanish, that countries then again tend to buy where it's cheapest, because they use tax money. That's basically what we experienced in Austria. So I think it would come back to kind of normal. Whether it's the normal we have in mind from 2019, I don't know.
Harald, thank you very much. Then now we can move to the next round of questions. And there were in the chat, there were three of them, three students, I think, and you said, well, I raised my hand.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for your words thus far. I would be wondering more, going back to kind of the first part of your presentation, how long does it kind of take for increased trade to reflect on economic growth? So you've touched on kind of factors that would either boost it or slow it down, such as institutional quality and the absence of corruption. But could you maybe give a bit more tangible input on how this is kind of measured or so on? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for insightful lecture. I wanted to ask on a more general level. I think it's safe to say that the Washington Consensus mantra is washed up, and it proved to be highly inefficient, if not detrimental, for the global South, such as let's say Latin American countries and Balkanese countries. So my question would be, after all this liberalization that basically devastated a lot of the domestic economies, what would be the policy prescription which would be in tune to liberalizing economy for these ill-affected regions of the world? I mean, that is to say, what other policy then to go into this Asian model of protectionism for a while and then again opening up for, is there actually, thinking out loud, is there a model which would reconcile liberal ideas with protectionism to the benefit of the states in question? Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. And I think Maria also had a hand up.
Yes, that's me. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question basically relates more on the African continent context. I want to know how trade globalization is going to affect African developing countries. And on the other hand, given the COVID-19 situation and the insurgence of electronic commerce, how this new situation is going to affect the position of women in developing countries. I would very much like to know something about that and your opinion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with these questions, I'm going to hand over to you again, Harald.
Thanks. Well, to the first one on the trade effects on GDP, well, actually in these models, they are all contemporaneous. So they are actually kicking in immediately. And so that would imply for every year you're increasing your trade flows, you would have this 0.3% additional increase in GDP, for example. And you also ask on how institutions and stuff is measured. Well, that's of course a difficult task to do empirically. Here we typically have to rely on some indicators provided by international organizations that look at, well, the well-functioning of the public service, the absence of corruption, and so on and so forth, law and order, protection of property rights. So it's more like going into economic institutions that is typically included here. The second question, I would say, is a difficult one. First of all, it's not so clear about the Washington Consensus. So just recently there was a paper that came out that basically empirically showed that the Washington Consensus indeed worked not too bad. However, with respect to your Asian type of model argument you brought, that's something which is not new and something which is perfectly accepted also in the more market-based type of institutions like the WTO. You have this argument for protectionistic, so the possibility for protectionistic measures for infant industries, and that's something you will always need. So if you want to just come up with and build your own industry in some certain sector, then you will always need to have some protective measures at the beginning, because otherwise you would just be overwhelmed from imports from other countries, and you would never succeed in this regard. So in my point of view, that's all perfectly possible, and it's all fine. I think the other question that will dominate the next 10 years or so, at least, I would guess, is so what is China actually doing better than the rest of the world? So it seems to be that China is also not strongly affected by COVID after all. So China will be growing this year. China will increase its share in total world trade this year. And basically they are at the moment most successful in coping with COVID-19. You, of course, can be very skeptical about the way they are doing it. That's very difficult to understand with our Western values for sure, but in terms of economics or economic outcomes, they are really successful. And that's basically, I would think, one of the main reasons for this very harsh conflict between the US and China, because we're actually talking about who will be the most important economy in the world in a few years. So that's something I think we should think much more. With respect to the African economies and trade and COVID and women, well, I think that's a difficult question, but of course it's also not with a very positive outlook. So what we have seen until COVID-19 is that Africa has become more and more embedded in the world economy, which helped a lot of people in Africa out of extreme poverty, which has been successful to some degree, at least, I would say. And if you stop this process, which we have now, then you will fall behind again. So in general, that's bad. And then, of course, with respect to women, I think it will be even worse for them, because quite often women are the first to lose jobs. Women are the first that have to take care about other issues, especially if you're in a pandemic and so on and so forth. We also see this in Europe, basically, if we have a lockdown, who is going to offices and who has to do homeschooling. And that will be, of course, more severe in Africa, and that doesn't look too good, actually.
Thank you. But Daniela, I think you had your hand up before.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was curious because since the 2014, the EU has imposed different types of sanctions against Russia in their response to the illegal annexation to Crimea. And I was wondering kind of what could actually be realistically achieved by these sanctions, and if the sanctions have influenced the crisis further.
Thank you. And any more questions?
Yeah, I just have a real quick one.
Yeah.
So it's about about the correlation between export growth and GDP growth. So I think that was the 0.3 correlation. Is that considering net export growth and GDP growth? Or if not, if a country's exports increase only because of a proportionally larger increase in imports, would that have a negative effect on GDP growth?
Thank you. And Anna-Sophie, another question.
Yes, maybe for the non-Austrians among the participants here, could you maybe elaborate a bit on that Austria is often referred to as an export nation and kind of what Austria has gained from it and so on? Thank you.
Thank you. Harald, I think I'm going to hand over to you again.
Thank you. Thanks again for all questions. Well, the first one on the Russia sanctions with respect to Crimea, what we actually see is that it's not very successful, right? So if you're how should I say, if from a policy perspective you decide to stick to some policies, then it's rather difficult. That's basically what we see all over the world, to use economic measures to change your opinion. So I haven't seen that has been very effective in a lot of cases. Just think about Iran or the Russia sanctions or the total embargo against North Korea, etc., for example. In terms of, it's not very successful, I would say. So in my point of view, this is much more a policy questions on how and what you want to react on, given some policy action from some of the countries in the world. And so it's not about, I would say it's not about an economic question here, it's much more about a political question on, I don't know, on what you as a European Union want to do if you're not happy with Russia's policy in this respect, basically. With respect to the graph, so that the graph is just an illustration and basically shows if you're, so that's also something for a 4 years period always, and for 6 regions, so it's a very aggregate level. And as we know, it's simply that we're exporting most of our products to the nearby economies. So in this graph, what we actually would see, if export volume grows a lot, at the same time import volume grows a lot, because everything that is exported needs to be imported as well, right? And that should be basically the answer to your question. We always have to see this on 2 sides, and the story is basically opening up allows you to trade different products. So we are benefiting from imports that we can have, and cheaper prices due to these imports in some markets and for some goods, while we have an export industry which is allowed to export its products, and there we generate additional income. So that's the basic logical thing of trade liberalization here. And the last point on Austria as an export nation, yes, we are. So we're, I would say, one of the kind of textbook cases of what economists would call a small open economy. So we're small, we're very small actually, and small economies tend to be very open. The reason is simply due to the fact that we are small, we cannot produce everything we want to consume within the boundaries of our country. And in order to afford those imports, we need to try to be competitive on some export markets in order to have the income necessary for being able to buy those imports, right? So Austria is a very open economy. So if you just look at the share of GDP, it's above 50% since, I don't know, basically since 1995, where we joined the European Union. And here is basically also the large market for Austria. So Austria's export to more than 2/3 are going to our fellow European member states, where about 30% of our total exports are going to Germany. So basically, we're very much dependent on Germany. If Germany is running well, we are running well as well. And what we basically see is, I did a study for ministry last year, or this year, last year on, yeah, last year. For 25 years of our referendum on joining the European Union. And our finding is basically that joining the European Union increased annual GDP growth in Austria by 0.6%. So that would be a number on how we benefited from being part of the common market, of the single market.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to read now Morges's question. He says he's been kicked out of the internet 3 times, so he wrote it in the chat now. So, quote, given the experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which excessive reliance on other countries exposed many states, can the theory of total specialization in international trade still hold true? End quote. So that's one of the questions. Then Sarah, I think you also had your hand up. And I hadn't seen
Yes,
it.
thank you very much for your presentation. I would have a question regarding the security argument for protectionism that came up only recently due to the COVID-19 crisis. For example, Macron saying that France has to produce all the masks themselves. Do you think this is a trend here to stay, or that those arguments or ideas will be forgotten soon, or at the latest after the crisis?
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I think we'll do this as the last round of questions. So anyone who still wants to ask a question, just indicate and raise your hand. In the meantime, Harald, I'd be also interested in something.
Okay.
So because you spoke about multilateralism and there should be multilateral solutions, and I completely agree with that. But then diplomacy always produces negotiated outcomes. So there's usually the free trade is handled a little selectively, you know, so favoring some states more than others. So in an ideal case scenario, how would such a multilateralism look like? So in terms of the process, perhaps, but also in terms of the outcome.
Okay.
Is there anyone else who still wants to ask a question? Otherwise, then I'm gonna, yeah. Harald, I'm gonna hand over to you for the last round of responses.
Thank you very much again for all questions. So the first one on total specialization hold true. I wouldn't agree that we actually experience a world with total specialization after all. So if you look at trade data, the most trade that we actually observe is within industry trade. The trade I've been talking before is between industry trade. So we are importing some goods that we are not producing on our own, and we are exporting goods that others do not produce. So that would be across industry trade. But actually the figures show that 2/3 of all trade is actually within industry trade. And that's just to give an example, that is the fact that we're having Japanese cars, European cars, US cars, and we're trading all with each other. And we have European and Japanese cars in the US cars not so much, but still in Europe and in Japan. And that would not be total specialization, because total specialization would tell us we only have one country or one economic area that produces cars and sells cars everywhere. So I think that's not necessarily the case, that we do have this total specialization. But your question is also related to the second one, I would say, on security argument and this Macron argument on mass production. We have the same arguments basically across at least the Western world, so also in Austria, also in Germany, also in the US, that we need to produce some stuff on our own. What reality shows us basically, that has been, for example, in Austria, that has been a political statement that we need to bring this production back. And then you had two companies that actually changed their production and started producing masks. And then they never get any masks bought by the government, because until they had changed the production, masks were more frequently available also again from China, and the government bought those masks with a price of 1/3 again from China. So I don't know whether it will last. I understand policymakers that they need to make this argument. What I'm a bit frustrated with is the fact that we're always or that we kind of quite often see policy reacting very quickly on something and not thinking about what can we change in the medium run. So actually, all of the countries I mentioned before have plans for pandemia. So they have plans for a pandemic, but they never just invested in what the plan was saying. So if we would have had masks available that we bought 3 years ago, where market was not tight at all, then we would not have run into this problem. But since spending taxpayers' money, and which would imply that you cannot afford any maybe interesting project from the government's perspective, governments are not keen of doing this. And I think that has to change. We have to have better plans and stick to plans and be prepared for unlikely events that can happen. And the last one on from you, Markus, on ideal multilateralism. I don't know, of course, because in a perfect world, you would have, I think if you, I don't know, you have either one person, one vote, or one country, one vote in this type of multilateralism. And in both with respect to European institutions or to like WTO, which has this one country, one vote, and every country has a veto position, doesn't really work, right? So I think both things are not perfectly working. And so what economists would typically think about, well, how can we design incentives for multilateralism? And one idea that is again around with Biden being president-elect, and we articulated also a couple of years ago during the trade conflict with China and the US, was basically, well, if you really want to change something in this world, and if you want to use the economy as your incentivizing strategy, then what you actually would need is a very close cooperation between the European Union and the US. So if these two regions, which are among the 3 largest economic areas in the world, would agree on principles like, let's say, minimum standards for climate policies, then that would incentivize China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, many more, and also the African economies to stick to those regulations because they want to serve these 2 very large markets. And if you're only allowed to serve them when obliging to these rules, then I think that can work better. As Europe alone, I think we can try, but with the US together, we would be much more successful on a global scale, I would guess.
Harald, on this hopeful note, actually, for the future, that's how I interpret it. Thank you very, very much for a great talk. Thanks a lot for answering all our questions. And let me emphasize again, also on behalf of others of the ÖFG network who have listened in, Franz, Irmgard, Susanne, I've seen you on Zoom. We're very, very happy to have you in our group. You're the latest addition, and we're very happy that you're there. And we're looking forward to many, many more wisdom about economics in the years to come. To all of you, students, obviously, very much as well. Thanks a lot for listening in. And I hope you had a great time. I definitely did. And we're going to continue in this ÖFG lecture series with talks by Rainer Bauberg on migration, and with a talk by Gabriele Spielker on climate change. Everything in November. For details, you can look at our website, and everything. Everyone who has attended by Zoom now can attend via Zoom again, and those who have joined us via Facebook can join via Facebook again. So then I wish you a very nice evening. Thanks again, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It's been a great honor, a great pleasure, and thanks for all the questions. It was very interesting, really. Thanks.